if you were here last year or if you missed last year's roundtable, you can read the December issue of PBSA, which has expanded pieces from that conversation in the issue. And you can look forward to this coming December's issue of PBSA, which will have expanded versions of what we're talking about today. So today's speakers are each going to give a little sort of 5-minute thing about what they want to say about exhibitions. And then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to the audience. The new scholars panel starts at 1, and I intend to wrap this up at 10 minutes or 5 minutes, at least by 5 minutes before, so you get a little bit of a break if you need to dash out and get coffee and come back in. But I know you all will want to come back for the new scholars. So our 3 speakers today, in order of their presentations, first up will be Clara Drummond, the director of the Charles Deering McCormick Library of Special Collections and University Archives at Northwestern University. Clara also actually chaired the subcommittee that put together this morning's sessions, which were really wonderful, so thank you, Clara, for that. Following Clara will be Shira Buxbaum, who has the blessing of a really bookish last name. Shira is the Susan Jaffe Tain Director of Exhibitions and Communications at the Grolier Club. And last, but by certainly all means not least, is Molly Schwartzberg, who gave us the idea for this. Molly is the Philip Hoffer Curator of Printing and Graphic Arts at Houghton Library at Harvard University. And I just realized I forgot to tell you all, I am Sarah Warner, I'm editor of PBSA, that's why I'm standing here. But now, Claire's gonna come up. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice. I just want to say how grateful I am to have an opportunity. The only people I usually get to speak to exhibitions about are those who are making exhibitions with me. So how lovely to have a moment to have a broader conversation about bookish exhibitions. I am just going to I just have some general ideas about exhibitions, some of which could be construed as bibliographical in nature, but just a sort of overview of some ideas I think about when I am making exhibitions. I just have one, this is my only slide. This was an exhibition titled Openings. So anyone who has worked have to think about titling exhibitions. It's the worst part, what the title is going to be. And this was called Openings because it was the first exhibition I did when I was at Penn State after the pandemic. So the Openings was this idea of reopening. So literally the physical space was opening. But then I think it was only 21 book items. And it was this question of we as book curators and exhibition curators have to choose, we have these objects which are meant to be interactive and meant to be touched, but as soon as we put them in a glass case, we have to make a choice about what opening or what cover we are showing. So it was a play on this idea. And I do want to point out the irony, which we could talk about more, right, of taking these objects, which again, in institutional contexts are often used in reading rooms, right? We encourage people to request them and touch them, but we are, in the exhibition work we do, doing the opposite of that. And this was a pop-up book by Colette Fu, for those of you who know her incredible work that she does with pop-ups. So this brings me to this first point I want to talk about, visual material pleasure. So we are often in exhibitions thinking about the visual attractiveness of the book. We want our objects tend to be smaller than what you're going to find in museums, and we have to work really hard to think about how we're creating spaces that are visually interesting. And that, to me, connects to this question of the materiality of the book and this particular book, this specific copy that is in this exhibition now, and what I want to say about the materiality of this object. Gatherings, juxtapositions, these are two sort of animating ideas for me, especially, so again, I work in an institutional context, so I work with a lot of students about what I am trying to do when I'm making exhibitions. So the idea of gatherings is we're bringing together it could be a theme, it could be an author, materials that are often sometimes within a collection, but across our collections, so we're bringing them together into the space. Sometimes even describe it as a kind of collection building. It's a whole other topic. But, and also the gatherings of a case, right? So we're both thinking about the larger gathering, and then we have to think about, we have these spaces, these cases that we have to fill, and within the cases, this idea of juxtaposition. So this idea of we're placing items beside one another and across from one another, and sometimes cases are facing one another. So really thinking about the relationship of the objects in space, but then in relationship to their form and content. I often describe what I'm trying to do as it's both like a metaphor and literal idea of creating little cities. So we are creating little cities in our cases, and that means as a design principle, that means we have different heights and different planes, visual planes, and that's a way to make our sometimes boring textual objects, not always boring, but visually boring, more interesting. And then cities works also as the metaphor for sort of gathering, like the gathering of like people within the space is also something that I'm always thinking about, how they'll move through the space and how they'll interact with the materials. The last brief thing I want to say is, like we all know, textual objects and books are really about collaborative labor, right? Like no text gets created by one person, and it's really important for, I think all of us who are going to speak about exhibitions, that they are deeply collaborative in nature. And I started like writing out all the kinds of people who are involved. If you find yourself in an academic institution, there's the students, faculty, there are always colleagues, there can be collectors, other curators, then there's the conservation staff, the mount makers, the graphic designers, the editors of the text, the communications people, the registrars, right? We could go on and on. Like, it is so essential to this work that is collaborative, and it's one of my favorite things about this exhibition work.
Thank you, Clara. I'm Shira Buxbaum. I'm, as Sarah said, the director of exhibitions at the Grolier Club, where we do 7 exhibitions per season. And taking up the notion, as Clara teed me up, of exhibitions as a bibliographic collaboration, I want to examine the organization and afterlife of one of the most well-known and influential club exhibitions, which was 100 Books Famous in English Literature. It was held at our home. This is the clicker? In 1902. It's actually not that home. It was a different home. That's our third home, current home. We had 3 homes. 100 Books Famous in English Literature, which sounds more or less like the name on the package. It was 100 books in English literature. And if you look at the list today, there's some classics that many readers will easily recognize. Shakespeare, Paradise Lost. There are others that I wouldn't know from Adam. But given the prominence of the Grolier Club and the favor accorded to its exhibitions, the club, after all, is the first institution in the United States that treated books and prints with the same seriousness afforded to traditional artwork, meant that the exhibition set off a period of artificial inflation for high spot collectors eager to collect the entire list. And for what it's worth, only 2 collectors ever came close to acquiring that full list: J.P. Morgan, J.K. Lilly Jr. And that's the prevailing story of that exhibition. It's a canonization, intentional or not, that shaped the collecting habits of gentlemen buyers whose collections underpin at least 2 of our venerated institutions today. It's nothing to sniff at legacy-wise. But the notoriety of 100 books in English literature has overshadowed the original premise and logistics of organizing the exhibition. Like most of the exhibitions in the Grolier Club's first decades, 100 Books was a collaborative show comprising loans from many members and institutions. The whole point is that no one person had everything on the list, and it wasn't even a definitive list. They argued about what to put into it in correspondence that you can find in our archives. Nonetheless, the Grolier Hundreds became an exhibition model that the club has revisited over the decades in shows including 100 Books Famous in Science in 1964, in Medicine 1994, Children's Literature 2014, and Typography as recently as 2021. And like the first Grolier 100, these Grolier Hundreds comprise selections primarily from members' collections, occasionally supplemented with institutional loans, and they reflect the highly collaborative nature of our program. To tell the story of the book, any book, at any time, is to tell a story of exchange, sharing, and collaboration. But I would be remiss if I did not stress how much has changed. We've been putting on view exhibitions of books and prints for 142 years, and we rapidly approach our 1,000th exhibition. And of those, a dozen have taken up the hundo model. As visitors to our galleries today might observe, our second floor gallery is devoted to exhibitions from our members' own collections, and we encourage those curators to go deep on niche and marginal topics. Imaginary books, lost, unfinished, and fictive works represents that 100-fold. No pun intended. Curator Reed Byers introduced visitors to the notion of an imaginary book by presenting simulacra of such books found in all kinds of literature. Whether you are a reader of classics, mystery, science fiction, history, romance, you've encountered an imaginary book in your reading. The entire exhibition was a celebration of that aha moment, when the concept clicked for a visitor. We could actually hear the ding go off inside their head. Our ground floor exhibitions tend to offer broader surveys of topics. Afterwards, visual and experimental poetry in small press and little magazines, curated by Steve Clay and MC Kinneborough, who I think is here today, is one brilliant example. Thoughtful, attentive, and gracious as they were in their broad and deep inclusion of many poets working in many modalities, they often reminded me and my colleague Oscar that 137 works would simply spawn 137,000 opinions. Even as the gathering of this material produces a bibliographic document, it's necessarily incomplete. The exhibition is instead a prompt, it's a path, it's a poem of a kind. Which is to say, I don't abide by the 100 model. Exhibitions are not exhaustive, nor should they be. This can be a very hard pill for our curators to swallow. And most of our curators are very often private collectors who may in fact be the world's expert on their collection focus. They are themselves bibliographers and scholars in the truest sense. But they are also very often exhibition novices. An exhibition with us at the club might be the first, possibly only instance of exhibiting their works in a public arena and on that scale. And even our repeat curators must absorb our evolving approaches each go around. So we orient and reorient our collaborators to best practices and introduce them to the kinds of constraints at work in a gallery: word limits, lateral and vertical space, the laws of physics. 100 books is not definitive, but it is defined in that it is a useful starting point to consider the lens and scope of interpreting a body of material for new encounters by visitors and readers alike. With that, I'll hand it over to Molly.
So I'm going to wrap us up with some general observations on thinking about exhibitions as a genre of bibliographical work, and I think it deserves to be added to the ways that we think about the practice of bibliography. The possibilities of bibliographical work are shaped by the publication environment, whether a book or a magazine, a library catalog record, a digital humanities site, or an exhibition gallery. I'm just going to toss out some of the ways that the constraints of a gallery shape the bibliographical work that we do there. First, constraint is a condition in which we suffer. One is the available spaces that you have to use and the shape, size, depth of your exhibition cases. There are many books I haven't been able to exhibit simply because when they're open, they simply can't be opened far enough for you to close the case down on them. Conservation considerations determine what you can include in a bibliographical work in exhibition form. Light exposure can be a deal breaker. The amount of time that an item is going to be on display, we have strong rules about this. And things like costly treatments required before display, and the complexity of building exhibition mounts or physics can shape decisions about what you include. These, I'm assuming, are not things that matter to you when you are writing a journal article. Also, your audience is not clearly defined. You never know exactly who's going to walk into your gallery, but how many PBSA subscribers are actually going to see this show, whether you want them to or not. And who is going to come in who you do not anticipate. Another and the worst constraint is your audience is standing. And I always say to students, nobody has to watch your exhibition. Nobody has to view your exhibition. It's not like a professor reading a paper. People can walk away the minute they just don't feel like standing anymore. So those are some of the constraints that this environment produce, and there are many more. But constraints are also the possibility of exhibitions. Small exhibition spaces, which I've had many opportunities to work in, are beautifully suited to bring to light the darker corners of bibliography, such as lesser known creators and communities, oddball bibliographical phenomena, and flash-in-the-pan moments in the history of books that can be explained in anywhere from 6 to 40 objects. Galleries small spaces are also ideal for students, and many of us are now using exhibition spaces as environments for students to learn, and these are often very bibliographically oriented students, undergrad or grad students, to help them learn how to think for different kinds of audiences as they grapple with all of the constraints of the gallery. Galleries, like digital environments, do not limit how the visitor moves, although they encourage, of course. But visitors, as we know from lots of studies, they do not follow the paths provided to them. And I'm sure Shira has thoughts on this, but when faculty and students want to do exhibitions, they often are like, well, could we put some arrows on the floor to show them that this is the way to walk when I tell them that that won't happen? And I'm like, no, you need to address the fact that they might move in any order in which they want, and you need to make it productive for them because they are authoring it through their movements. So that's a really exciting expansion of how you think when you are planning an exhibition. Those standing audiences and their feet mean that curators always need to think in terms of pattern, color, and scale. You can't have 5 very similar editions in a row unless the blandness of that is actually meaningful to you and to your audience. And it can be if well done. But the scale of books is something you can leverage in a way that you can't really in any other format. I did an exhibition with a colleague called Big Books, Tiny Tomes, where we juxtaposed monumental books with miniature books. It was a huge hit, and I think people actually really paid attention to thinking about scale. Also, regional and institutional priorities can really be leveraged in the constraint of a gallery. You're limited to the collections that you hold often in institutional collections, and we tend to think in terms of anniversaries and historical moments and donations, and you have opportunities that you wouldn't have necessarily for traditional print publication. Exhibitions can be remarkable sites of regional bibliography. Topics that may not have an audience in a traditional publication venue are of high interest to localized audiences. And finally, for those of us who do literary exhibitions, this constraint of the gallery becomes method. The gallery is not just a plus or a minus, it is the fundamental core of what we do as bibliographical scholars. As curatorial work has changed over the last 30 years or so, our bibliographical work has changed accordingly. With some exceptions, and I bless these lovely people who are very lucky, curators of rare book collections do not get to write bibliographies of their collections. They don't get to write articles or books about their collections. But what we can do is exhibitions. They're part of our fundamental role of getting our collections out to audiences, and we're required to fill gallery spaces if we're lucky enough to be in an exhibition that has that kind of physical plant. And so it is the default of how we think about our intellectual work as curators, and it is the space in which we're able to carry out our own aesthetic, creative, and bibliographical passion projects. So with that, I'll leave it up to everyone to ask us questions, and Sarah, I guess we'll open that up. Thank you.
These are already on. Oh, they're already on. I love this. Thank you all for your comments about this. One of the things that I'm going to do an open question, and then we can open it up to you all. I'm struck, as I assume we all are, by the accounts of how much intense work, both sort of physical work and intellectual work, goes into preparing exhibitions. So part of what I want to ask you is, what are your thoughts on the afterlives of exhibition? Once the exhibition comes down, does it remain a resource to us? How does that happen? Open-ended question along those lines. Maybe each of you might have a brief thought about this. I'm sure you have many thoughts about this, but.
Sure. If you could hand the clicker. There's actually a slide that I stuck in because I kind of anticipated this question. So I wonder why. There we go. So for every single exhibition that we do at the club, we have a digital surrogate. All of the label copy and at least one image of every item that was on view in our physical space is put on our Omeka. In addition to, you can see here images from the gallery arrangement, so you get a sense of the physical instantiation of the gatherings of material. This is from afterwards, from MC's show, and this is the opening bookend of that exhibition, which this is sort of the whole conceit. But if you can see on the side here that at the top we have watch, an opening conversation, and so that's how we also incorporate the programmatic elements of our exhibitions and try to create as best we can a holistic experience for our distant visitors. We do get about 3,000 visitors to this site a month, so we are casting a pretty far-reaching net as opposed to maybe 3,000 in-person visitors over the course of the run of a show. And this website will remain online in perpetuity until the inevitable heat death of the universe. So it's here, and it comes at no cost to the curator. We do all the preparation in-house with the copy, the didactics, the images they provide us. We maintain it. It's part of our regular workflow. It is a large part of our workflow, but it also substitutes in some cases for the costly endeavor of a publication, which many of our curators do pursue at their own personal cost, but we try to reduce the pay-to-play element by ensuring that this free digital resource remains available as a record of the show after the fact.
The Grolier is very lucky for being a very small institution, which means it controls all of its own decisions. And also it's old-fashioned, so it's probably going to keep the same platform for a really long time. But libraries love to change and upgrade to the latest software. So I've seen online versions of exhibitions I've done disappear as priorities change, and they're just gone. It's really sad. I've only actually curated 2 specifically online exhibitions in 20 years, and I've only had 2 catalogs in my entire career, even though I've done major exhibitions, because the institutions that I've worked for don't have budgets dedicated to publication, and there has to be an endowment whose words say this is for publication, and that can even often be taken away to use for digitization. So getting a catalog made has only happened for me when there's been a donor who's going to pay for it, or leverage was needed with the donor, and so the publication was planned. So getting these things to last is really difficult. It used to be that we would publish about these on our blog at UVA, and that was great. We don't really have a blog at Houghton. I mean, we do, but nobody uses it, and so it's sort of, I don't think we're really encouraged to, but like as everybody's supposed to post on social media, but like we don't own that. I'm not going to put it up there. So there are a lot of issues for institutions for getting a permanent record of an exhibition anywhere other than in our institutional collections, which are not cataloged for the world to see. Those are like our working files behind the scenes. So big issue depending on the institution and how its funding is structured.
Yeah, my experience is a lot like Molly's. The only time I had to work on digital exhibitions was during the pandemic, when our physical space was closed. I have experimented, and I have also only done a very small number of traditional catalogs as a exhibitions curator. We did experiment when I was at Penn State with publishing their very rare publications, sort of pamphlets, which were like the label copy and then images, so with like a very brief introduction. We only printed 250 of them, but we added them to the collection, so you can request them. We also experimented with adding notes in the bibliographical records to say this material appeared in this exhibition, which I've been really excited about because you can now search the title of the exhibition in our catalog and get the list. And just one more thing is that I did an exhibition while I was at Penn State on history of die making and dyes in books with a faculty member, Sarah Rich, and we were invited by Journal 18, which is an online 18th century journal. They have a section called Curators' Notes, where they invite curators of exhibitions to, again, they're sort of short pieces. They're not peer-reviewed, but they're invited to sort of write about the behind-the-scenes experience, and it included images of the cases and then individual items. So that was an interesting experiment with the afterlife, the exhibition.
Thank you. I'm just going to say really briefly, what I said when last year, sort of like, no, exhibitions are not bibliographical notes, and talking about exhibition is not a bibliographical note, but PBSA does have a section of our journal called Reflections, which is the section under which last year's conversation happened and this year's conversation will happen. And I think, and I'm assuming, I'm looking at Jonathan, Jonathan will undoubtedly agree with me now that I've put him on the spot, that is a place to talk about exactly the sort of issues that you're talking about, the preparation, the understanding, the afterlife of exhibition and exhibition work. I actually saw that, Jonathan, you had a question, so I'm going to...
I just wanted to add to this that the art librarians have a review journal now for library exhibitions. It's part of our list. And so it's, I think, only a couple of years old, but I'm very happy to see now that the reviewing of these ephemeral experiences and collections and work has a place to be as well.
The Book Collector has long had a section on exhibition reviews, but I don't know how they select them, and I do think it's important to have more than 1 or 2 journals doing that.
Yeah, so I'm just going to ask, do we have microphones available for all the audience if the audience has questions? Jonathan's going to do that. And also, PBSA reviews, a handful of years ago, we really deliberately stopped calling them book reviews because we thought there is so much more to bibliographical research and output than a book. So exhibition reviews could be part of that as long as other resources. We have time for questions. Are there questions from the audience for our speakers?
Or examples
Or
of great bibliographical exhibitions?
Or examples of great bibliographical exhibitions?
All right, that's super loud. I have a question about how you bring exhibition work into teaching.
I'll start that one, which is that...
Assignments do you come up with, and and how do you bring the community into it? How do you grade those sorts of
fortunately,
assignments?
I don't have to do that part.
I know Clara has.
The best thing about being a librarian is not having to grade anyone's work.
I also don't grade, just to be clear.
Faculty, I haven't done this yet at Harvard, but at UVA I did it several times because we had because I was one of the people who ran the gallery spaces for a while, and we had a lot of different spaces that could be used in different ways. So we had a lot of room to say, hey, I want some students to do a show. But the way that we generally did it was with faculty who had to reach out to us well in advance, plan the whole thing out in advance, and we pre-selected materials from which the students would choose their items. So the theme of the exhibition was already set. There's a lot of constraints that you have to add before you're going to have a productive experience with students. But I would also say that classes are themselves exhibitions. Class visits are a form of bibliographical work. If you have somebody who says, I'm interested in colonial publications in Southeast Asia, and I want to bring my students to Houghton, you're putting on a miniature exhibition, and you can be doing really important and interesting work in putting together the first show and tell for a class on a topic. So there are a lot of ways that teaching intersects with exhibitions.
Yeah, I think, Julie, the kinds of work that I've done, but I've done both semester-long exhibition projects with like a history of the book class where the final group collaborative project is a physical exhibition or a digital exhibition. Some of the assignments that I have done with that are like my labor writing boot camp session and like collaborative writing of the introductory text are some of the like assignments that we have done. But pop-up exhibitions, which is more like a class, like what you're doing in a class, have also been great pedagogical tools where it's not like the whole gallery, right? Sometimes we just have them for the day or the afternoon. We'll invite like the department to come and the friends of the students, and they get to stand there. What I really like about that is it's both, they have to write a label text, but it's also a kind of oral presentation. Because I ask them to be ready when someone comes up to like explain, what is this thing? Why should I look at it? Like, those are the basic questions to answer.
Christian Dupont at Boston College. Thank you. This is good. I wanted to ask more about doing exhibitions for the purpose of gaining more bibliographic control over an area, whether it's a collection that's wholly within your institution or working with other institutions that have similar holdings, and the main point of the exhibition being to, learn more about the bibliography, or provide some bibliographical control that can benefit others in that. Have you done anything like that, or others in the room?
I certainly have. I mean,
I know you have, Mom.
Doing an exhibition is a great way to learn a collection. And so actually, when I started my job at Houghton, there was an upcoming exhibition on bindings at Houghton Library. And I was like, oh, I'll do that. And then I had an excuse to wander through the stacks
and just pull random things off the shelves for weeks on end. So gaining your own control over the collection, intellectual control over the collection, or a part of the collection is a great reason to do an exhibition. But also at Houghton, long before my time there was a regional exhibition called Beyond Words, which was, I think there were 8 or more institutions that participated in an exhibition on illuminated manuscripts in the Boston area. This is a really important piece of research, huge project. I don't know how they did it, but and they produced a remarkable catalog that is an essential research and ended up improving the catalog records of all the institutions, especially Houghton. All the manuscripts that were in the show, were improved directly because of the exhibitions. So yes, exhibitions can be really important for that. Also, like things like provenance, you don't often want to. There are many things that you can't put in an exhibition unless you have a provenance, chain. Because and if you don't have that provenance chain, that's something you're going to start working on. So it can reveal issues in your collections that you want to resolve.
I was even thinking, that's great examples, Molly, of just others where maybe it's a zine or somewhere, or the fur trapping or somewhere, where there's been no sort of knowledge of an area or collecting, and the means of sort of developing, what level of description, what kinds of description are useful.
I haven't had so much, definitely provenance, I'll just echo the provenance research part of that. What's interesting I feel like I haven't had the luxury, so many of my exhibitions are collaborative in nature that it's not me as the curator sort of deciding this is an area of our collection that I want to, that it's sort of a specific interest, so that's an interest. Yeah, I feel like the provenance research we do regularly as exhibition work, and we often add it back into the catalog when we figure things out. And students are really excited to see their research appear publicly available. But yeah, I feel like the kinds of exhibitions I'm doing are often, there's constraints, other people who have ideas, especially with students and that, so.
Sure. For our ground floor gallery exhibitions, we expect that there will be an accompanying publication, which of course, again, we could criticize the pay-to-play model all the livelong day, which, asks curators to put in their own money or find money to support, oftentimes a fully illustrated, up to a fully illustrated hardback reference or source. But the resulting books are themselves extraordinary references that go on to serve the types of research that is being done in institutions. Pat Peisner's exhibition on miniature books some number of years ago is an excellent example of the deep research she put into describing these works in a new way. I think the current exhibition that we have up, the Second Printing Revolution from Jeremy Norman's collection, takes up a difficult endeavor that many of us encounter in terms of describing machine printed materials. And he expands our bibliographic purview not just from the items themselves, but the circumstances in which they were made, and looking beyond the literature into things like patents and brevets and other sorts of contextual material that can inform those types of bibliographic endeavors.
And we have time for a last question from Jean Marie.
Okay, Jean Marie Musto from New York Public Library, and I thought I'd pick up on Claire's suggestion of great bibliographic exhibitions in your several minds.
Jean Marie, can you hold it?
Oh, great bibliographical exhibitions from your perspective.
So what are great?
Which ones have occurred? Yes.
Well, to me, there's a very obvious one, which is Marks in Books, which just celebrated its 40th anniversary. This is Roger Stoddard's major show at Houghton that really shaped the field of looking at the annotations and marks in books other than the marks that were intended to be there by the print in print. And that exhibition actually was remounted on the 40th anniversary with modifications, with additions of material acquired since. And that exhibition catalog is something that people are always trying to acquire. If you want one, you have to pay $250. That's how significant that exhibition is seen in its particular bibliographical area. I'd say another one that I think is important is my colleague David Whitesell at UVA did a retirement exhibition in which he selected items and discussed how he'd acquired them and from whom. In doing so, giving a record of how one curator thought about collecting in the era in which he was building a collection. We don't know enough about that for different curators, because these are human beings making these decisions, but also brought in the labor of booksellers and talked about the collaboration between booksellers and curators in collections. And that's also something that's really not often recognized or studied. And so I know of another curator who is doing an exhibition now based on that model. So I think that hopefully will become an interesting, for people who feel like I don't ever really want to do a show like that, but for people who want to do a kind of a retirement show, I think that that's a really great idea, and I hope that other curators take it up.
I would just say I don't have an answer to that, but this is such an opportunity. I often am reading about curating in the broader like glam world, like outside of libraries, and especially in contemporary art, I think there's a lot more conversation about what it means to be a curator, and part of that in the art world is like exhibition. Like exhibition making is a huge part of what it means to be a curator. So I actually think we are missing sort of the foundation, like that even that question of like what are the foundational bibliographical exhibitions that we as like a community of people who make exhibitions and see exhibitions, because again, artists and contemporary art curators will have like an answer to that, and there will be various publications. I was just reading like curatorial work as activism as an example, and it goes through all the important 20th century like art exhibitions that have been foundational. So it's an interesting, like even that question points out to me the ways we have not taken the work seriously as scholarly work.
From the club's recent history, I would point towards building the book From the Ancient World to the Present Day from the Rare Book Schools collection. Barbara Heritage and Ruth Ellen St. Onge curated that in 2022. And that was an extraordinary endeavor in putting on view the teaching materials that Rare Book School uses to support the extraordinary sessions. And again, expanding the types of resources that we're incorporating into our collections to make sense of all of these material objects. On a sort of funnier note, I didn't put this in the slides, but there's an amazing letter from the 1940s when a member wanted to put on view his bibliographies of fishing materials collection and wanted to ship fish models to the club, and he just needed the person who made the models to pack them up. And there's a great letter from the chair of the Committee on Arrangements saying, I would hate to feel a responsibility for these fish models. Please do not put this on us. But again, that sort of speaks to beyond the book, but the realia rather, that encompasses these objects and troubled the idea of record making for these broader collections than just sort of a printed work. So you might encounter some fish in your libraries, and you're going to have to deal with it. Yeah.
I love the letter, the very polite sort of, I would hate to be responsible. Like, what a lovely way to turn down the offer. I want to say thank you to our panelists for some really great thoughts about exhibitions and its connection to bibliography. Thank you all.